Do you enjoy what you're hearing and want to support the channel? Feel free to click join just below to help me keep creating more content. By the way, here's a fun question. What's your favorite snack or drink while listening to these stories? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious to find out. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the next story. Mark Thompson walked home in his usual post-work days, the late-night quiet wrapping around him like a cold, heavy blanket. His breath hung in the air in thin wisps as he moved along the empty street, the occasional flicker of a streetlight breaking the monotony of his path. The end of his shift at the factory was always the same. Exhaustion settled in his bones, and his mind wandered to simple thoughts: food, warmth, rest. Tonight should have been no different. But the creeping sensation that he wasn't alone followed him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts like a persistent whisper in the dark. It was a familiar walk, one he had taken countless times. Yet tonight, everything seemed sharper, more vivid. The distant hum of traffic felt distant, as if the world had moved on without him. A strange chill snaked its way down his spine, causing him to pull his jacket tighter around his shoulders. His footsteps echoed in the night, the only sound breaking the eerie stillness. Mark glanced over his shoulder for the third time, a subtle but unmistakable sense of unease settling in. Nothing was there, of course, just empty streets and long shadows cast by the occasional street lamp. He tried to shake the feeling, telling himself it was just the fatigue playing tricks on him. But something didn't sit right. He wasn't the type to get spooked easily. He had seen enough of life's rough edges to know what real fear was. But this was different, like an itch he couldn't scratch or a whisper he couldn't quite hear. It wasn't until he reached the corner of Willow Street that he saw her. A woman stood alone under a flickering streetlight, her figure barely discernible in the dim glow. She was facing him, though her face was hidden by the fall of her dark hair. Something about her posture, tense, alert, caught his attention. She wasn't just standing there, she was waiting. And it wasn't for him. Mark slowed his pace, unsure of what to make of the scene. She seemed out of place, as if she had wandered into his world from somewhere else entirely. Her head turned slightly, and for a moment he could see the fear etched across her face. The kind of fear that digs into your bones and doesn't let go. "There you are," she called out, her voice trembling slightly, though it carried an air of familiarity, as if they had known each other for years. Mark stopped in his tracks. He didn't know this woman. He had never seen her before in his life. Yet the way she moved toward him, her arms reaching out as if in relief, sent a wave of confusion crashing over him. Before he could react, she was upon him, throwing her arms around his neck in a desperate embrace. Mark stumbled back, startled by the sudden contact. "What?" "Please," she whispered, her voice thick with panic. "You have to help me. Someone's following me." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He tried to step back, to put some distance between them, but she clung to him as if her life depended on it. His eyes darted around, searching for the source of her fear. And then he saw it. Just beyond the streetlight's reach, half hidden in the shadows, a figure stood motionless. It was hard to make out any details. The darkness swallowed everything except for the faint outline of a person, or what looked like one. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. "You see him, don't you?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yeah, I see him." The figure remained still, a shadow among shadows, as if it were waiting for something. The hair on the back of Mark's neck stood on end. He didn't know what this was, but every instinct in his body screamed that something was very, very wrong. "We need to get out of here," Mark muttered, glancing down at the woman. She was shaking, her grip on him unrelenting. "Please," she whispered again. "Don't leave me." Mark swallowed hard, his mind racing. He couldn't just leave her here, not with that thing lurking in the shadows. But he didn't want to lead it back to his apartment either. "Come on," he said, more firmly this time. "We'll go somewhere safe." They began to walk, keeping to the main street, where the streetlights provided some semblance of security. Every few steps, Mark glanced back, half expecting the figure to be gone. But it wasn't. It was still there, always just on the edge of his vision, never getting closer but never falling behind. "Who is he?" Mark asked, his voice low. The woman Lena, she had said her name, shook her head. "I don't know. He's been following me for days. I thought I was imagining it at first, but he never gets closer, he just follows." Mark didn't respond. What could he say? This wasn't the kind of thing that happened in real life. Stalkers didn't just appear out of nowhere and silently follow their victims through the night. There were rules to the world, and this thing, whatever it was, didn't seem to follow any of them. They continued walking in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like a physical force. Mark kept his eyes on the road ahead, trying to think of where they could go. His apartment was out of the question, and there wasn't anywhere nearby that felt safe. "There's a diner a few blocks from here," Mark said, more to himself than to Lena. "It's always open. We can sit there for a while, wait him out." Lena nodded, though her eyes never left the shadows behind them. "Okay, but hurry." The diner came into view a few minutes later, its neon sign flickering in the distance like a beacon in the darkness. Mark quickened his pace, practically dragging Lena along with him. The door jingled as they stepped inside, the warmth of the place a stark contrast to the cold outside. A few late-night patrons sat at the counter, nursing cups of coffee or plates of greasy food, but none of them paid much attention to the newcomers. Mark led Lena to a booth near the back, away from the windows but still within sight of the door. He slid into the seat across from her, his mind racing. What now? The waitress came over, her eyes scanning the two of them with mild curiosity. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee," Mark said, his voice tight. "2 coffees." The waitress nodded and disappeared behind the counter, leaving them alone in the booth. Lena hadn't spoken since they sat down, her eyes glued to the window. Mark followed her gaze, half expecting to see the figure standing outside. But the street was empty. For now. "What's going on?" Lena, Mark asked, his voice low but steady. "Who is he? Why is he following you?" Lena didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, which were still trembling slightly. "I don't know," she said finally. "I don't know who he is or what he wants. He just started following me a few days ago, and no matter where I go, he's always there. I thought I was losing my mind at first, but what?" Mark pressed. "He's not." "Human," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's something wrong about him, the way he moves, the way he looks. It's like he's not really there." Mark's stomach turned. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she was just scared and imagining things. But he had seen the figure too, and it hadn't looked human to him either. The waitress returned with their coffee, setting the steaming cups down in front of them with a forced smile. "Anything else?" Mark shook his head. "No thanks." As soon as she was gone, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We need to call the cops." "They won't believe me," Lena said, her eyes wide with fear. "I've tried. I went to the station 2 days ago, and they just told me it was probably some guy who liked me and didn't know how to approach me. But this isn't that. This is something else." Mark rubbed a hand over his face, trying to think. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to show up." Lena looked like she was on the verge of tears. "What do we do then?" "I can't go home. He knows where I live." "We'll go to my place," Mark said, though every instinct in his body told him it was a bad idea. "Just for tonight. We'll figure something out tomorrow." Lena hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." Mark reached into his pocket for his wallet, throwing a few bills onto the table. Come on, let's go. They left the diner quickly, stepping back into the cold, quiet night. Mark scanned the street, looking for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing. Just empty sidewalks and the distant hum of a passing car. Maybe they had lost him. Maybe it was over. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. His apartment wasn't. Far, just a few blocks, but every step felt heavier than the last, like he was walking towards something inevitable. Lena walked beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. Mark tried to keep calm, to act like everything was fine, but his heart was pounding in his chest. They reached his building without incident, and Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He unlocked the door and led Lena inside, up the stairs to his small, one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Or at least it should have been. Mark locked the door behind them, double-checking the deadbolt before turning to Lena. "You can take the bed. I'll sleep on the couch." Lena nodded, looking more exhausted than ever. "Thank you," she whispered. Mark didn't respond. He was too busy listening, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. But the apartment was silent, save for the faint creak of the floorboards under his feet. "I'll grab some blankets," he said, moving toward the closet. "Just make yourself comfortable." Lena disappeared into the bedroom, and Mark busied himself with setting up the couch. He tried to convince himself that everything was fine now, that they were safe, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't stop. As he lay down on the couch, pulling the blankets up to his chin, he stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Who was that figure? What did it want? And why was it following Lena? Sleep didn't come easily. Every noise outside made him tense. Every creak of the building made his heart race. But eventually exhaustion took over, and Mark drifted into an uneasy sleep. He didn't know how long he had been asleep when he woke up. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. For a moment, Mark didn't know what had woken him. But then he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like breathing. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he sat up, his eyes scanning the room. Nothing. But the sound was still there, faint but unmistakable. He held his breath, listening. It was coming from the bedroom. Mark stood up slowly, his body tense. He moved toward the bedroom door, his footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. The breathing was louder now, shallow and quick, like someone trying to control their fear. "Lena," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. There was no response, just the breathing, faster now, more erratic. Mark's hand hovered over the doorknob. He didn't want to open it. Something told him that whatever was behind that door wasn't Lena, but he had to know. He turned the knob slowly, pushing the door open just enough to see inside. The room was dark, but he could make out Lena's figure lying on the bed, her back to him. She was trembling, her body shaking violently. "Lena," Mark whispered again, stepping into the room. And then he saw it. Standing in the corner, half hidden in the shadows, was the figure. The same figure that had followed them through the streets. Its eyes were fixed on Lena, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Mark froze, his blood turning to ice. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. It just stood there, watching. Mark's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to do something, but his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed with fear, his legs rooted to the spot. And then, slowly, the figure turned its head toward him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The figure's eyes were empty, hollow, like black pits of nothingness. It stared at him for what felt like an eternity, and in that moment, Mark knew. This wasn't a man. This wasn't even human. Before Mark could react, the figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting like heat waves in the desert. Mark stumbled back, his mind screaming at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure took another step, and then another, its hollow eyes locked on Mark. And then, without warning, it vanished. Mark blinked, his heart racing. The room was empty. The figure was gone. He rushed to Lena's side, shaking her awake. She gasped, sitting up abruptly, her eyes wide with terror. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was here," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was right here." Lena's face went pale. "We have to leave," she whispered. "Now." Mark didn't argue. He grabbed his keys and they fled the apartment, running into the night without looking back. Jonah Stevenson adjusted his rearview mirror for the 100th time, casting a quick glance at his daughter, Clara, as she squirmed in her car seat. Her excitement was palpable, her tiny legs bouncing up and down in uncontainable energy. Jonah smiled. It was moments like these that made the early morning drives to her kindergarten bearable. Even after a long week of juggling work and fatherhood, seeing her pure joy gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't known before Clara came into his life. "Daddy, Daddy," Clara's voice rang out like a bell, filled with eagerness as she leaned forward in her seat as much as her harness would allow. "Let's play the game." Jonah chuckled softly, his tired eyes brightening at her enthusiasm. The game was a simple one they'd invented together during their daily drives. Clara would describe something she saw out the window, giving clues until Jonah guessed what it was. Sometimes it was a cloud shaped like a dog, other times it was something less tangible, like the color of the sky or the rustling of leaves. Today, though, the world outside was a drab shade of gray, with overcast clouds hanging low in the sky and a light drizzle streaking across the windshield. All right, we can play," Jonah said, his voice soft but steady. "But you've got to give me some good clues this time. None of that tricky stuff like last time." Clara giggled mischievously. "I promise, Daddy. I'll give you easy clues." "Okay, go ahead," Jonah replied, glancing again at her through the rearview mirror, his heart swelling with affection. "I spy with my little eye. Something." Red Clara chirped, her hands waving excitedly in front of her as she glanced around, waiting for her dad to guess. Jonah squinted at the road ahead, eyes scanning the familiar landscape. The usual scenes passed by the rows of trees lining the neighborhood, the occasional car parked along the curb, the old brick buildings of the town that Clara had come to know as home. "Red, huh?" Jonah mused, pretending to be deep in thought. "Is it the stop sign up ahead?" Clara paused for a moment and then erupted in laughter. "No, Daddy, that's too easy." "Well, it's red," Jonah protested, grinning as he caught her reflection in the mirror again, her face scrunched up with glee. "Try again," Clara prompted, shaking her head, her ponytail bouncing with the movement. Jonah loved this about her. Even at 4 years old, Clara had a fierce determination that reminded him so much of her mother. His chest tightened slightly at the thought of Amanda, how she would have loved to be here, laughing along with them, basking in these little moments of joy. But Amanda was gone now, taken too soon in an accident that had shattered their world 2 years ago. Since then, Jonah had thrown everything into being the best father he could be, though he often felt like he was navigating uncharted waters without a map. Okay, Jonah said, clearing his throat and pushing the ache in his chest aside. "Is it that red car over there?" He gestured toward the curb where a bright red sedan was parked. Clara let out an exaggerated sigh, pretending to be disappointed. "No, Daddy, it's not the car." Jonah grinned, narrowing his eyes playfully. "Hey, Mom, I'm running out of red things to guess. Is it the flowers in front of Mrs. Anderson's house?" "Yes," Clara shouted triumphantly, clapping her hands. "You got it, Daddy." "Woo," Jonah said, letting out a mock sigh of relief. "I thought I'd never get it." Clara giggled again, her laughter a sound that Jonah would never tire of. As they continued their drive, The conversation drifted to lighter topics: what Clara planned to do at kindergarten today, which of her friends she was most excited to see, and whether or not the rain would stop in time for recess. Jonah listened intently, savoring every word. These were the moments that mattered most, the ones that made all the struggles worth it. But as the town's outskirts gave way to open fields and rolling hills, Jonah's thoughts began to drift back to Amanda. It had been hard without her, harder than he ever could have imagined. She had been the glue that held their little family together, the light that kept the darkness at bay. When she was taken from them, everything had changed. Jonah had been left to pick up the pieces, to be both mother and father to Clara, all while dealing with his own overwhelming grief. He hadn't been ready. Nobody ever was. The first year had been the hardest. Clara was too young to fully understand what had happened, too young to grasp the permanence of death. For weeks she had asked when Mommy was coming back, her innocent questions cutting deeper than any knife ever could. Jonah had done his best to explain, to comfort her. But how do you explain to a 3-year-old that her mother is gone forever? How do you explain something you don't fully understand yourself? Jonah had tried to hold it together for Clara's sake. He threw himself into work, into fatherhood, into anything that kept him busy enough to not think about the gaping hole Amanda's absence had left in their lives. But there were still nights when, after tucking Clara into bed, he would sit on the couch in the dark, staring at the empty spot where Amanda used to sit. And in those moments, the grief would wash over him like a wave, drowning him in memories of what could have been. Daddy Clara's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "HM. What is it, sweetie?" Jonah asked, glancing back at her again. "Are you sad?" Clara asked, her big brown eyes full of concern. Jonah's heart twisted. Clara was perceptive for her age, always seeming to pick up on his moods, even when he tried to hide them. He forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, baby," he said softly. "I'm just thinking." "About Mommy?" Clara asked, her voice quiet. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected her to be so direct, though he supposed he shouldn't have been surprised. Clara often spoke of Amanda, her memories of her mother vivid and clear, even though she had been so young when it happened. Jonah was grateful for that, grateful that Clara still remembered the woman who had loved her more than anything in the world. "Yeah," Jonah said after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was thinking about Mommy." Clara was silent for a moment, and then she said, "I miss her." Jonah blinked rapidly, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I miss her too, sweetie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every day." Clara didn't say anything more, but Jonah could see the sadness in her eyes, the way her small hands gripped the edges of her car seat tightly. For a moment, the weight of their shared grief hung heavy in the car, the sound of the rain tapping against the windshield the only noise breaking the silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Clara spoke again, her voice brighter, as if she had made a conscious decision to lighten the mood. "Daddy, can we listen to music?" Jonah exhaled, grateful for the change in subject. "Sure thing, kiddo. What do you want to listen to?" Ramstein, Clara shouted gleefully, bouncing in her seat. Jonah couldn't help but laugh, his heart lifting slightly at her enthusiasm. Clara's taste in music was eclectic, to say the least. He had no idea where her love for heavy metal had come from, but it was something she had latched onto in the past year, and he wasn't about to discourage it. If it made her happy, that was all that mattered. "Ramstein," Jonah teased, raising an eyebrow. "You sure you don't want something a little more relaxing?" Clara crossed her arms over her chest, her expression serious. "No, I want Ramstein." All right, Jonah said, still chuckling. "Ramstein it is." He reached over to the car's stereo system, scrolling through his playlist until he found Clara's favorite track. As soon as the heavy guitar riffs filled the car, Clara started nodding her head in time with the music, her tiny fists pumping in the air like a miniature rock star. Jonah couldn't help but smile. Clara had a way of bringing light into even the darkest moments, and for that, he was endlessly grateful. As the song played, Jonah allowed himself to relax, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. Maybe things weren't perfect, but they had each other. And in the end, that was what mattered most. The drive continued, the rain outside beginning to let up as they neared the town again. Clara, still immersed in her music, seemed to forget the earlier sadness, her mood buoyant once more. Jonah glanced at her, marveling at her resilience. She had been through so much in her short life, yet she carried on with a strength that amazed him every day. "Hey Clara," Jonah said after a while, his voice soft. "You know, Mommy would be so proud of you." Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide and curious. "You think so?" Jonah nodded, his throat tightening. "I know so. She loved you more than anything. And she's always with us." And here he placed a hand over his heart, his voice thick with emotion. "She'll always be with us." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing his words. Then she smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up her face. "I think so too, Daddy." Jonah swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. He had promised himself he would be strong for Clara, that he wouldn't let her see the depth of his own pain. But moments like this reminded him that he didn't have to carry the burden alone. They were in this together, father and daughter, navigating the rough waters of life side by side. The rest of the drive passed in comfortable silence, the storm clouds beginning to part as the first rays of sunlight broke through the gloom. By the time they reached Clara's kindergarten, the sky had cleared completely, and a soft warmth replaced the earlier chill. Jonah pulled into the parking lot, glancing over at Clara as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "You ready for school, kiddo?" Clara nodded enthusiastically, grabbing her backpack and slinging it over her shoulder. "I'm ready, Daddy." Jonah smiled, watching as she opened the car door and hopped out, her excitement palpable. He followed her, locking the car and walking with her toward the entrance of the school. Clara skipped ahead, her ponytail bouncing with every step, her earlier sadness seemingly forgotten. As they approached the front doors, Clara spotted her teacher, Miss Reynolds, standing just inside the doorway. She waved excitedly, and Miss Reynolds waved back, a warm smile on her face. "Good morning, Clara." "Good morning, Mr. Stevenson," Miss Reynolds greeted them as they reached the door. "Good morning," Jonah replied, smiling back. "How's everything going?" "Great. Clara's been a joy to have in class," as always, Miss Reynolds said, her eyes twinkling as she looked down at Clara, who was beaming with pride. Jonah's heart swelled with love for his daughter. She was his world, his everything, and he would do whatever it took to make sure she was happy and safe. "All right, kiddo," Jonah said, crouching down to Clara's level. "You have a great day at school, okay?" Clara nodded, throwing her arms around him in a tight hug. "I will, Daddy." Jonah hugged her back, savoring the moment before letting her go. "I'll pick you up later, okay?" "Okay," Clara said, giving him one last smile before turning and running into the school, her backpack bouncing as she disappeared down the hallway. Jonah stood there for a moment, watching her go, his heart full. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more tough days, more moments of grief and heartache. But as long as he had Clara by his side, he knew they would be okay. With a deep breath, Jonah turned and walked back to his car, ready to face whatever the day had in store. Jonas Winters sat behind the wheel of his truck, staring blankly at the narrow driveway leading to the old house. His hands were still on the steering wheel, knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. The engine had been off for nearly 15 minutes, but he hadn't made a move to step out of the vehicle. He couldn't. Not yet. The air was cool, though not freezing. The late autumn chill clung to the dying leaves that swirled along the gravel driveway. The house loomed in the distance, surrounded by the forgotten woods, secluded from the world, a relic from another time. It was a place Jonas had hoped never to return to. Yet here he was, parked outside the home he had inherited from his father, the house he had sworn he would never live in. But that wasn't the reason for the knot of tension in his stomach. He hadn't come back because of the house itself. It wasn't about the broken windows or the sagging porch or the memories of a childhood spent hiding from his father's drunken rage. No, what weighed on him most, what made his chest tighten and his breath come in shallow, uneven bursts, was what lay inside the house. Or rather, who? With a deep breath, Jonas finally opened the door and stepped out of the truck. His boots crunched on the gravel as he moved toward the porch, each step heavy with the weight of what he had to face. His mind swirled with thoughts of her Nebbia, the woman who had once meant everything to him, the woman he had taken captive. He paused at the foot of the porch steps, staring up at the peeling paint and the sagging roof. The house was decaying, much like the life he had tried to build. He had thought it would be different better. But now, standing here, he realized how naive that had been. Nothing could stay the same, not forever. Not when you kept someone locked away like an animal. Jonas let out a long, shaky breath and climbed the steps, each one creaking under his weight. The front door groaned as he pushed it open, the familiar scent of damp wood and mildew greeting him like an old, unwanted friend. Inside, the house was just as he had left it, dusty, cluttered, and eerily quiet. The furniture, draped in white sheets, looked like ghosts in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. Everything was frozen in time, as if the house itself had given up on the idea of change. But there was one room that was not like the others. One room that had been maintained, kept alive by a presence that Jonas couldn't escape. He locked the door behind him, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the deadbolt. The sound of the lock clicking into place sent a shiver down his spine, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a lead blanket. He had done this. He had made the choice that brought him here, and now he had to live with it. The narrow hallway stretched before him, dim and oppressive. At the end of it was the door to the basement, the door behind which he had hidden Nebbia for months. It was a door he had learned to hate, a door that symbolized everything he had lost: his freedom, his sanity, his morality. Jonas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the key, the cold metal heavy in his hand. He held it for a moment, staring at it as if it were a lifeline, a bridge between two worlds: the world of the man he had been and the world of the man he had become. A part of him wanted to throw it away, to turn his back and leave Nebbia behind forever. But he couldn't. He had made his choice, and there was no going back. He inserted the key into the lock and turned it slowly, the sound of the tumblers clicking into place like the opening of a tomb. The door creaked open, revealing the steep stairs that led down into the cold, dark basement. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and rot, a sharp contrast to the cool autumn air outside. Jonas descended the stairs, each step echoing through the narrow space. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, the low ceiling pressing down like a physical weight. He hated this place, this prison he had created. But it was the only place where Nebbia couldn't leave him. The only place where she was his. At the bottom of the stairs, a single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting dim light across the small room. The walls were bare, cold concrete, and the floor was littered with old newspapers and boxes. In the far corner, a thin mattress lay on the floor, covered by a tattered blanket. And there, sitting on the edge of the mattress, was Nebbia. She didn't look up when Jonas entered. Her once vibrant dark skin was pale now, ashen from months without sunlight. Her hair hung in tangled, ragged strands around her face, and her clothes, an old sweater and faded jeans, were torn and stained. She looked like a ghost, a hollow shell of the woman she had once been. Jonas stood there, frozen, his eyes locked on her. He wanted to say something, to explain, to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? That he was sorry. That he hadn't meant for things to go this far. That he still loved her? The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. Nebbia didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't even look at him. She was just there. I brought you something to eat, Jonas finally said, his voice hoarse. He held up the brown paper bag he had brought with him, but Nebbia didn't acknowledge it. She just sat there, staring at the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Jonas set the bag down on the floor next to her mattress, his hands trembling. He wanted her to eat, to take something from him, even if it was just food. He wanted to feel like he was still taking care of her, like there was still some part of her that needed him. "I brought you some clothes too," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're upstairs. I'll bring them down later." Still, Nebbia said nothing. Jonas stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the silence was unbearable, crushing him from all sides. He had to leave, had to get out of this room, away from her. But as he turned to go, her voice, barely more than a whisper, stopped him in his tracks. "Why?" It was just one word, but it was enough to freeze Jonas in place. He turned slowly, his eyes wide with surprise. She was looking at him now, her dark eyes filled with a mix of anger, sorrow, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. "Why did you do this?" Nebbia's voice was weak, but there was a fire in her words that made Jonas's stomach twist. "Why didn't you just let me go?" Jonas swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That he had been afraid, that he couldn't stand the thought of losing her, that he had acted out of love, out of desperation. "I didn't want to lose you," he said finally, his voice trembling. Nebbia let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and cold. "You lost me the moment you brought me here." Jonas flinched at her words, the truth of them cutting through him like a knife. He had known, deep down, that this would happen. He had known that keeping her here, locked away from the world, would destroy any chance of them being together. But he had done it anyway. I thought I could make you see," Jonas said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that if I kept you here, you'd remember how it used to be. How we used to be." "How we used to be," Nebbia's voice was sharp, her eyes narrowing as she glared at him. "You mean before you decided I was something you could own? Before you decided my life was yours to control?" Jonas winced again, her words hitting him like physical blows. He hadn't seen it that way, not at first. He had convinced himself that he was doing this for both of them, that he was saving their relationship. But now, looking at her, seeing the way she had withered in the darkness, he realized how wrong he had been. "I never meant to hurt you," Jonas said, his voice barely audible. "Then why did you?" Nebbia's voice cracked, her hands trembling as she gestured to the chains around her wrists. "Why did you do this to me?" Jonas had no answer. He stood there, his mind racing, his heart pounding. He had wanted to save her, to save them both. But now, looking at the wreckage of their lives, he realized there was nothing left to save. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Nebbia. Sorry." Nebbia's voice was sharp, cutting through his apology like glass. "You think sorry makes this okay? You think sorry erases everything you've done?" Jonas felt the tears prick at the corners of his eyes, the weight of his guilt and regret pressing down on him like a vice. He had never meant for it to come to this. He had never meant to hurt her, to trap her in this hell. But intentions didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the reality of what he had done. "I don't know how to fix this," Jonas admitted, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to make it right." Nebbia stared at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. And then, finally, she spoke. "You can't." The words hit Jonas like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. He had always believed that there was a way to make things right, that if he just tried hard enough, if he just found the right words, he could fix what had been broken. But now, standing in front of Nebbia, seeing the emptiness in her eyes, he realized that some things couldn't be fixed. Some things, once broken, were lost forever. Jonas turned away, unable to look at her any longer. He climbed the stairs slowly, his feet feeling like lead, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with every step. When he reached the top, he closed the door behind him, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in the silence. He stood there for a long moment, his heart heavy with regret. And then with trembling hands, he slid the key off the chain around his neck, holding it in his palm. For a moment, he considered throwing it away, leaving it behind and never looking back. But he couldn't. Not yet. With a deep breath, Jonas slipped the key into his pocket and walked away from the door, his footsteps heavy as he made his way back to the truck. He didn't know what he would do next, didn't know how to move forward from here. All he knew was that he had made a terrible mistake, one that he could never undo. The truck rumbled to life as he turned the key in the ignition, the engine's low growl filling the silence. But even as he pulled away from the house, the weight of his actions clung to him like a shadow, following him wherever he went. The sound of giggling filled the small kindergarten classroom as children darted from one corner of the room to another, their little bodies full of the restless energy that only 5-year-olds seem to possess. Jonas Stevenson stood at the doorway, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on his daughter, Clara, who was busy building an elaborate structure out of blocks with a friend. A soft smile tugged at the corners of Jonas's lips as he watched her. It was moments like these that gave him peace, the sight of Clara, innocent and full of life, so blissfully unaware of the weight he carried. In her world, everything was simple, and her happiness was pure. It was a stark contrast to the complicated emotions that constantly swirled inside him. "Hi, Mr. Stevenson," a gentle voice called out from behind him, interrupting his thoughts. Jonas turned to see Adriana Ruiz, Clara's kindergarten teacher, walking toward him. She was carrying a stack of books, her warm brown eyes sparkling with that same easy kindness that always put him at ease. Adriana had been Clara's teacher for the past few months, and in that time, Jonas had come to admire her patience and dedication. More than that, though, she had become one of the few people in his life he felt he could really talk to. "Hello, Ms. Ruiz," Jonas greeted her with a small nod, his voice soft but steady. "You don't have to call me MS. Ruiz," she said with a playful smile. "Adriana is fine. We've known each other long enough, haven't we?" Jonas chuckled, feeling some of the tension in his shoulders ease. Force of habit, I guess. Adriana set the stack of books down on a nearby table and crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze shifting from Jonas to Clara, who was now laughing loudly as her tower of blocks came crashing down. "She's doing well," Adriana said softly, her eyes softening as she watched Clara. "She's made a lot of progress since the beginning of the year." Jonas nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened slightly. He knew Clara was thriving in school, but there was always a part of him that worried. She had been through so much more than any child should have to endure. Losing her mother at such a young age had left scars. Even if Clara didn't fully understand the magnitude of it all, Jonas did, though. He lived with that loss every day. "I'm glad," Jonas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Adriana glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly in concern. "How are you doing, Jonas? Really?" Jonas hesitated, not sure how to answer. He had grown used to deflecting questions like that, brushing off his own feelings in favor of focusing on Clara's well-being. But with Adriana, it was harder to hide. There was something about the way she looked at him, like she could see right through the walls he had built up around himself. "I'm managing," he said finally, though the words felt hollow even to him. Adriana didn't push him, but she didn't look away either. "It's okay not to be okay," she said softly. "You don't have to do this all on your own." Jonas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his chest tightening as he looked down at the floor. He knew she was right, but admitting that he was struggling felt like a betrayal somehow. A betrayal of the promise he had made to Clara to be strong for her, to give her everything she needed, even if it meant sacrificing his own happiness. I don't want Clara to see me fall apart," Jonas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's already lost so much." Adriana stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his arm. "She's lucky to have you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "But you don't have to carry all of this by yourself, Jonas." It's okay to lean on someone else. Jonas looked up at her, his heart aching with the weight of her words. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that it was okay to let someone in. But after everything that had happened after losing Amanda, he wasn't sure if he could. It felt too risky, too vulnerable. But Adriana's gaze was steady, her presence calm and reassuring. She wasn't asking him to be perfect or to have all the answers. She was simply offering him a lifeline, a way out of the darkness he had been drowning in for so long. Thanks, Jonas said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. I appreciate that. Adriana gave him a small, understanding smile, her hand lingering on his arm for just a moment longer before she pulled away. Anytime she said softly, and I mean that. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the classroom fading into the background as they shared a quiet connection. For the first time in a long time, Jonas felt like he wasn't completely alone. The days blurred together after that, each one filled with the routine of fatherhood and work. Jonas did his best to keep things running smoothly for Clara, making sure she was happy and safe. But no matter how hard he tried, there was always a part of him that felt like he was barely keeping his head above water. He hadn't realized just how much he had come to rely on Adriana's presence until one afternoon when he arrived at the school to pick up Clara and found Adriana waiting for him at the door. Hey, she greeted him with a warm smile as he approached. I was hoping to catch you before you left. Jonas raised an eyebrow, curious. What's up? Adriana hesitated for a moment, glancing down at her hands before meeting his gaze again. I've been thinking about what you said the other day, she began slowly, about how hard it's been for you, with Clara and everything else. And I just wanted to offer, well, I wanted to let you know that if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. Jonas blinked, surprised by her openness. He wasn't used to people offering help so freely, without expecting anything in return. But there was something genuine in Adriana's eyes, something that made him believe she really did care. I appreciate that, Jonas said, his voice softer than he intended. Adriana smiled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I mean it, Jonas. I've seen how much you love Clara, how hard you're working to give her the best life you can. But I also see the toll it's taking on you. You don't have to do this alone. Jonas felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. He wanted to argue, to tell her that he was fine, that he could handle it. But the truth was, he wasn't fine. He hadn't been fine for a long time. I don't know how to. I mean, it's been hard, Jonas admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Ever since Amanda, I just feel like I'm constantly trying to keep it together for Clara's sake, and I don't want her to see how much I'm struggling. Adriana's expression softened, and she took a small step closer, her gaze never leaving his. You're doing an incredible job, Jonas. But it's okay to admit that you're struggling. It doesn't make you any less of a father. In fact, it makes you stronger because you're doing everything you can to be there for Clara. Jonas swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent so long trying to be strong, to be the rock that Clara needed. But now, standing here in front of Adriana, he realized just how tired he was, how much he needed someone to lean on. Thank you, Jonas said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I'd do without Clara. She's all I have left. Adriana reached out and gently touched his arm, her touch soft and reassuring. And she's lucky to have you. Jonas looked down at her hand on his arm, the warmth of her touch seeping into his skin. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. Over the next few weeks, Jonas found himself opening up to Adriana more and more. Their conversations, once polite and surface level, had deepened into something more meaningful, something that made Jonas feel like he wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. Adriana had a way of making him feel understood, like he didn't have to pretend to have it all together. And slowly, Jonas began to let down the walls he had built around himself. It started with small things, talking about Clara's progress at school, sharing stories about their day-to-day lives. But eventually, their conversations began to touch on deeper topics: their fears, their regrets, the things that kept them up at night. One afternoon, after picking Clara up from school, Jonas found himself lingering in the classroom after the other parents had left. Clara was playing with her friends, and Adriana was tidying up the art supplies. The sun streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the room, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. Jonas began, leaning against one of the low tables. I never thought I'd be able to do this on my own. After Amanda, I didn't know if I could be enough for Clara. Adriana looked up from the box of crayons she was organizing, her brow furrowed in concern. You are enough, Jonas. More than enough. Jonas shook his head, a sad smile tugging at his lips. I know I'm doing my best, but sometimes it feels like it's not enough, like I'm failing her in some way. Adriana set the box of crayons down and walked over to him, her eyes filled with empathy. You're not failing her. You're doing everything you can, and that's what matters. Clara doesn't need perfection. She just needs you. Jonas's chest tightened, and he looked away, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him. He had spent so long trying to be strong, trying to hide his pain from everyone, including himself. But here, in this quiet moment, with Adriana standing in front of him, he felt the walls he had built start to crumble. I miss her, Jonas whispered, his voice thick with grief. I miss Amanda every day, and I don't know how to fill that space she left behind. Adriana's expression softened, and she reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. You don't have to fill that space, Jonas. It's okay to miss her. It's okay to grieve. But you also have to give yourself permission to move forward. Jonas swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words, how much he had been holding himself back, trapped in the past, unable to move on. I don't know how to move forward, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. It feels like if I do, I'm leaving her behind. Adriana shook her head gently, her hand still resting on his arm. You're not leaving her behind. You're carrying her with you in everything you do. She'll always be a part of you, Jonas. But that doesn't mean you can't find happiness again. Jonas looked into Adriana's eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something in her gaze, something warm and understanding, something that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this. For the first time in a long time, Jonas allowed himself to believe that there could be something more, something beyond the grief, beyond the pain. And as he stood there, with Adriana's hand on his arm and the soft hum of the classroom around them, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he didn't have to do this alone. As the weeks passed, Jonas found himself looking forward to his conversations with Adriana more and more. They had become a lifeline for him, a way to navigate the complicated emotions he had been avoiding for so long. And slowly he began to realize that he wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. He was healing. Clara, too, seemed to be thriving. She was more confident, more playful, and her laughter had become a constant presence in their home. Jonas could see the change in her, the way she had come to trust Adriana, and it filled him with a sense of relief he hadn't felt in years. One evening, after putting Clara to bed, Jonas found himself sitting on the couch, his thoughts drifting to Adriana. She had become such an important part of his life, and he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to take things further, to let her into his heart in a way he hadn't allowed anyone since Amanda. But even as the thought crossed his mind, doubt crept in. Could he really open himself up to someone again? Could he risk the pain of losing someone else? Jonas closed his eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to have them all. The next morning, Jonas arrived at the school to pick up Clara, just like he always did. But this time, when he saw Adriana waiting at the door, he felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in his chest, something warm, something hopeful. Hey, Adriana greeted him with a smile as he approached. Clara's just finishing up an art project. She'll be out in a minute. Jonas nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. For a moment he stood there, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to take the next step. But then Adriana looked up at him, her warm brown eyes full of kindness and understanding, and suddenly everything felt right. Adriana, Jonas began, his voice steady but soft. Would you like to have dinner with us sometime? Just the three of us. Adriana's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, Jonas feared he had overstepped. But then her face broke into a warm, genuine smile. I'd love that, she said softly. And in that moment, Jonas knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had found someone to lean on, someone who understood him, someone who cared. And for the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could move forward. Dr. Samuel Carter stared at his reflection in the small, cracked mirror that hung on the wall of the hospital's break room. His face was pale, eyes bloodshot, and dark circles clung to the skin beneath him like shadows. It was the face of a man who hadn't slept in days, a man worn thin by the weight of responsibility. He splashed cold water on his face, hoping to shake off the fatigue that gnawed at him, but it didn't help. Nothing seemed to help anymore. He straightened up and adjusted his scrubs, trying to remind himself that he had a job to do, that lives depended on him. But the truth was, Dr. Carter was exhausted emotionally, physically, and mentally. The pressure of being one of the lead trauma surgeons in a city hospital had been relentless for years, but lately, the weight of it had become almost unbearable. Every day was a struggle, and every decision he made felt like a gamble with someone else's life. The small break room door swung open, and a nurse popped her head in. Dr. Carter, we have an emergency. They need you in or 3. Now. Samuel nodded, already feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that always hit before a critical operation. It was the only thing that kept him going most days, the rush, the urgency, the knowledge that what he did mattered, that it could mean the difference between life and death. As he walked down the hallway toward the operating room, the sound of beeping monitors, hurried footsteps, and hushed conversations filled the air. The hospital was always in a state of controlled chaos, and tonight was no different. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting a pale glow over the gray walls. The air smelled of antiseptic and something metallic, a smell he had come to associate with the operating room. Who's the patient? Samuel asked as he approached the doors, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that clawed at him. The nurse who had followed him down the hall handed him a chart. John Turner, male, 43 years old. Car accident, severe internal bleeding, multiple fractures, and a punctured lung. We need to stabilize him now if he has any chance of surviving. Samuel skimmed the chart quickly, his brain processing the information. The situation was bad, but not impossible. He had dealt with worse. He pushed open the doors to the operating room, and the scene inside was one of grim urgency. The team was already gathered, scrubbing up, preparing instruments, and assessing the patient, who lay unconscious on the table, his body bruised and battered. Dr. Carter, one of the nurses, greeted him, her voice tight with worry. We've been trying to keep him stable, but his blood pressure keeps dropping. He's in bad shape. I can see that, Samuel replied, moving to the sink to scrub in. We don't have much time, so let's make this quick and clean. The surgical team fell into place as Samuel prepared to operate. His hands, steady and practiced, moved with precision as he began the delicate process of opening the patient's chest to assess the damage. Blood oozed from the deep gash in John Turner's side, pooling on the operating table. Clamp, Samuel called out, his voice calm but commanding. A clamp was placed in his hand, and he worked quickly, his mind a flurry of calculations and decisions. The internal bleeding was worse than he had anticipated. The liver was torn, and there were several small ruptures in the intestines. His heart rate quickened as he realized just how much was at stake. Doctor, his pressure's dropping fast, a nurse shouted, her eyes wide with panic as she watched the monitors. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained impassive. He couldn't afford to let his emotions get the better of him. Not here. Not now. "We need more suction," he ordered, his hands moving quickly but carefully. "Prep a transfusion and give me 2 units of blood, stat." As the team worked to keep the patient stable, Samuel's thoughts drifted, despite his best efforts to stay focused. How many times had he been here? How many times had he stood in this exact spot, fighting to keep someone alive, knowing that no matter how skilled he was, sometimes it wasn't enough? The life of a surgeon was one of constant pressure, constant decisions, constant risk. But it wasn't the operations that wore Samuel down. It was the ones he couldn't save. The ones whose faces haunted him long after they had been wheeled out of the OR, their hearts still and their families shattered. Those were the ones that kept him awake at night, the ones that made him question everything. "Doctor," he's coding. The shout snapped Samuel back to the present. His eyes shot to the monitor, where John Turner's heart rate had flatlined. The piercing sound of the flatline filled the room. "Get the paddles," Samuel barked, his hands already reaching for the defibrillator. "We're not losing him." The nurse handed him the paddles, and Samuel positioned them on the patient's chest. "Clear." The patient's body jerked as the electric shock surged through him, but the flatline persisted. Again, Samuel ordered, his voice tight with urgency. "Clear." Another shock, another jerk, but still no response. "Come on," John Samuel muttered under his breath, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't going to lose this one, not today. "Doctor," one of the nurses began, her voice hesitant, but Samuel cut her off. "One more time," he said firmly. "Charge it again." The nurse hesitated for a moment, but did as she was told. Samuel placed the paddles on the patient's chest once more. "Clear." The shock hit the patient's body, and this time, after a tense few seconds, the flatline disappeared. A weak but steady heartbeat appeared on the monitor. "He's back," the nurse said, relief flooding her voice. Samuel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders sagging slightly. But there was no time to rest. The patient was still critical, and they had a long way to go before he was out of danger. "Let's close him up," Samuel said, his voice calm again. "We'll monitor him in recovery." The team moved efficiently, working together to finish the surgery. As the hours ticked by, Samuel's exhaustion deepened, but he pushed through it. He had to. There was no room for weakness here. By the time they finished, it was well past midnight. John Turner had been stabilized, but the next 24 hours would be critical. Samuel stood at the sink, scrubbing the blood from his hands, his eyes unfocused as he stared at the water swirling down the drain. Another life saved. For now. But how long could he keep doing this? After the surgery, Samuel made his way to the on-call room, hoping for a few hours of sleep before the next emergency. The hospital was never quiet, but there was a lull in the usual chaos, a momentary reprieve that Samuel hoped to take advantage of. He collapsed onto the small cot, his body aching with exhaustion. But as he closed his eyes, the events of the day played over and over in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about John Turner, the look of his battered body on the operating table, the sound of the flat line, the feeling of helplessness that had gripped him when the patient had been on the edge of death. Samuel had been a surgeon for over a decade. He had seen it all: gunshot wounds, car accidents, stabbings, heart attacks. He had saved countless lives, but he had also lost more than he cared to admit. And no matter how many people he saved, the ones he lost always weighed heavier. He had long ago accepted that death was part of the job. He had learned to compartmentalize, to keep his emotions in check so he could do what needed to be done. But lately, it had been harder. Lately, the weight of it all had begun to suffocate him. His thoughts drifted to his family, his wife Emily, and their daughter Sophie. He hadn't seen them in 2 days, caught up in the whirlwind of back-to-back surgeries and emergencies. Emily had been understanding, as always. She knew what the job entailed. But Sophie was only 6 years old, and every time he missed another bedtime story or dance recital, the guilt gnawed at him. He pulled out his phone and stared at the picture on the lock screen. Sophie, grinning up at the camera, her face smeared with chocolate ice cream. She had his dark hair and Emily's bright green eyes, a perfect blend of the two of them. She was his world, his reason for everything. But how long could he keep doing this? How long could he keep putting his job first, sacrificing time with his family for the sake of strangers? His phone buzzed with a message from Emily. "How's it going? We miss you." Sophie asks when Daddy's coming home. Samuel's heart clenched. He typed out a quick response, "Miss you too. I'll be home soon." But even as he sent the message, he knew it wasn't true. He didn't know when he'd be home. The hospital never stopped, and neither did the demands of his job. He let out a long, weary sigh and closed his eyes, hoping for a few moments of sleep. But the image of John Turner's broken body flashed in his mind again, and Samuel knew there would be no rest for him tonight. The next morning, Samuel was called back into for another emergency, a young woman, barely 20, who had been involved in a motorcycle accident. Her injuries were extensive, and the chances of survival were slim, but Samuel didn't let that stop him. He had learned long ago that you had to fight for every life, no matter how hopeless it seemed. As he scrubbed in for surgery, he caught a glimpse of himself in the reflection of the window. He looked older than his 39 years, the stress of the job etched into every line on his face. His once jet black hair was now streaked with gray, and his eyes, once bright with ambition, were dull with fatigue. "You okay, Dr. Carter?" one of the nurses asked as they prepared the patient. Samuel nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. He had learned to power through the exhaustion, to push aside the doubts and the fears. But lately it had become harder to ignore the cracks in the facade. The surgery began, and as always, Samuel's focus sharpened. He moved with precision, his hands steady and practiced, his mind calculating every move. The young woman's injuries were severe. Her ribs were crushed, her spleen had ruptured, and she had multiple fractures. But Samuel worked methodically, doing everything he could to give her a chance. Hours passed, and the tension in the room grew thick as the patient's vitals fluctuated. There were moments when Samuel thought they were going to lose her, moments when her heart rate plummeted and her blood pressure dropped dangerously low. But each time, Samuel fought to bring her back, refusing to give up. By the time they finished, the patient had been stabilized, but like John Turner, her fate was uncertain. The next few hours would be critical, and there was nothing more Samuel could do but wait. As he stepped out of the OR, drenched in sweat and exhaustion, he leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. His body ached, his hands trembled slightly, and his mind was a whirl of emotions. He had saved her for now. But how many more could he save? How many more could he lose? That night, as Samuel sat in the quiet on-call room, staring at the ceiling, he thought about the young woman he had just operated on. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he had seen the fear in her eyes when they had wheeled her into the OR. He had seen the desperation, the silent plea for help, and he had done everything he could. But was it enough? The weight of the job had always been heavy, but lately it felt like it was crushing him. The constant pressure, the long hours, the emotional toll, it was all starting to take its toll on him. He had dedicated his life to saving others, but in the process he felt like he was losing himself. He thought again of Emily and Sophie, of the life he had sacrificed for this career. He had missed so much birthdays, anniversaries, first steps. And for what? To save lives? To be a hero? But being a hero wasn't enough anymore. It wasn't enough to make up for the nights he spent alone in the hospital, or the guilt that gnawed at him every time Sophie asked when he would be home. He pulled out his phone and stared at the picture of his daughter again. She was growing up so fast, and he was missing it. He was missing her. His phone buzzed with another message from Emily. "How's it going? Sophie made a card for you." She says she loves you and hopes you'll be home soon. Samuel's chest tightened, and he typed out a quick response, tell her I love her too. I'll be home as soon as I can. But as he hit send, he felt a deep sense of unease settle over him. How long could he keep this up? How long could he keep sacrificing his family for the sake of his job? For years, he had believed that being a surgeon was his calling, that it was what he was meant to do. But now, as he sat alone in the cold, sterile hospital, he wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning, Samuel was called in for yet another emergency, a young boy, barely 5 years old, who had been hit by a car. His injuries were extensive, and the chances of survival were slim. But Samuel didn't hesitate. He scrubbed in and prepared for surgery, pushing aside the exhaustion and the doubts that had been gnawing at him for days. As he worked to save the boy's life, Samuel's mind was focused, his hands steady. But there was a part of him, a small, quiet part, that wondered if he could keep doing this, if he could keep pushing himself to the limit, day after day, year after year. When the surgery was over and the boy had been stabilized, Samuel stepped out of the OR, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had saved another life, but how many more could he save before he lost himself completely? He didn't have the answer. But as he walked down the empty hospital hallway, the weight of the job pressing down on him like a lead blanket, he knew one thing for certain. Something had to change. Dr. Victor Reese tapped his fingers rhythmically on the steel table, his gaze fixed on the large digital clock mounted on the wall of the sterile, fluorescent-lit lab. The red numbers blinked steadily, counting down the seconds to what would either be the greatest scientific breakthrough of the century or the start of a nightmare they wouldn't escape. 3 minutes until activation, a voice said through the intercom, cold and impersonal. Victor's eyes darted to the far end of the lab, where the containment unit stood. Inside was the culmination of years of secretive work, years of bending rules, breaking ethics, and crossing lines that no one dared cross. A metal chamber stood there, sleek and imposing, lined with reinforced glass and surrounded by cables, sensors, and equipment monitoring every aspect of what was to come. Are you sure we're ready for this? Dr. Amelia Rivera's voice cut through the tense silence. She stood next to Victor, arms crossed over her lab coat, her brow furrowed with concern. Victor turned to look at her, his face calm but his eyes betraying the nervous energy that pulsed beneath the surface. We've run every test, triple-checked the data. It's as ready as it'll ever be. But what if Amelia began, but Victor cut her off? We've prepared for every scenario, Amelia, he said, more firmly this time. We're on the verge of something extraordinary. Don't second-guess it now. Amelia bit her lip, clearly unconvinced, but she said nothing more. Instead, her gaze flicked back to the containment unit, where inside lay the key to everything they had worked for the subject. In the early stages of the experiment, they had called it Project Ether, after the ancient Greek concept of the upper air, the pure essence that the gods breathed. But now, it was simply the subject, an entity they had created, or rather, summoned from a plane of existence beyond anything the human mind could comprehend. Its form was still unclear, half energy, half matter, shifting and amorphous, contained only by the powerful electromagnetic fields and quantum barriers they had painstakingly constructed. 2 minutes, the intercom chimed again. Victor swallowed hard, trying to keep his focus. There was too much at stake to let his nerves get the better of him now. He had devoted the last 10 years of his life to this project, sacrificing everything: his reputation, his relationships, his career for this one moment. If it worked, they would be hailed as pioneers, as visionaries. But if it failed, he didn't want to think about what would happen if it failed. Amelia's voice broke through his thoughts once more, softer this time. Victor, I'm not asking if the equipment is ready. I'm asking if we're ready. Victor glanced at her, his jaw tightening. We don't have a choice. Amelia sighed, running a hand through her short, dark hair. You're right. I can't shake the feeling that we're about to open a door we can't close. Victor's gaze softened for a moment. He understood her fear, because he felt it too. The things they had seen, the things they had glimpsed in the early phases of the project had shaken them both. They had been playing with forces they barely understood, forces that didn't belong in their world. But it was too late to turn back now. Whatever happens, we face it together, Victor said, his voice resolute. Amelia nodded, though her expression remained troubled. 1 minute. Victor's heart pounded in his chest as the countdown neared its end. His hands were clammy, and his breathing had quickened. He forced himself to focus on the screens in front of him, where the energy readings from the containment unit spiked and fluctuated, the air inside crackling with unseen power. The final countdown began. 10, 9, 8. Victor's fingers hovered over the activation switch, his entire body tense with anticipation. 7, 6, 5. He glanced at Amelia one last time. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. 4, 3, 2. The air around them seemed to hum, the lights flickering as the energy levels surged. 1. Victor slammed his hand down on the activation switch. For a moment, nothing happened. The lab was eerily silent, save for the hum of the machinery and the soft beeping of the monitors. Then slowly, the containment unit began to glow. A faint, otherworldly light emanated from within, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. The air grew thick, heavy, as if reality itself was bending under the strain of what they had unleashed. Victor's eyes were glued to the unit, his breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the moment. The light grew brighter, more intense, until it filled the entire room, bathing everything in a surreal, iridescent glow. The monitors beeped frantically, the energy readings spiking far beyond what they had anticipated. Amelia's voice trembled as she stared at the containment unit. Something's wrong. Victor's pulse quickened. What do you mean? We're still within operational parameters. No, Amelia shook her head, backing away from the console. Look at the readings. The subject, it's destabilizing. Victor's eyes flicked to the monitors, his stomach dropping as he saw the energy levels fluctuating wildly. The electromagnetic fields surrounding the containment unit were fluctuating too, struggling to maintain their integrity. Damn it, Victor muttered under his breath. We need to reinforce the containment fields. He moved quickly, typing commands into the console, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he tried to stabilize the system. But the more he worked, the more erratic the readings became. Victor, it's not working, Amelia said, her voice rising in panic. The fields are failing. I'm trying, Victor snapped, his heart racing as he frantically typed in new commands. But no matter what he did, the system wouldn't respond. And then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out. For a moment, the lab was plunged into darkness. The only sound was the low hum of the emergency generators kicking in. Victor's breath hitched in his throat. He could feel that something had changed. The air was different now, charged with a strange, unnatural energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Amelia, he whispered, barely able to hear his own voice over the pounding of his heart. I'm here, she replied, her voice shaky. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the lab in a dim, eerie glow. Victor's eyes darted to the containment unit and his blood ran cold. The glass was cracked. A jagged web of fractures spread across the reinforced surface, the energy inside flickering and pulsing erratically. The subject was no longer contained, it was loose. Amelia's voice trembled with terror. What have we done? Victor's mind raced, panic setting in as he tried to think of a solution. We need to shut it down. We need to shut everything down before. Before he could finish his sentence, the glass shattered. The sound was deafening, like the crack of thunder in a storm. Shards of glass flew through the air, and a wave of energy rippled outward, knocking both Victor and Amelia off their feet. Victor hit the ground hard, his head spinning as pain shot through his body. For a moment, everything was a blur, light, sound, chaos. He could hear the alarms blaring, the machinery whirring frantically, but none of it seemed real. All he could focus on was the overwhelming sense of wrongness that filled the air. The subject was free. Victor struggled to push himself up, his muscles trembling as he forced himself to his feet. His vision was blurry, but he could see the containment unit, or what was left of it. The metal frame was twisted and deformed, the glass reduced to a pile of shimmering shards on the floor. And in the center of it all was the subject. It was like nothing Victor had ever seen. Its form was constantly shifting, twisting and writhing as if it couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. It was both solid and ethereal, a mass of energy and matter that defied all logic. Tendrils of light and shadow extended from its core, crackling with power. Victor's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the creature, a deep, primal fear taking hold of him. This wasn't what they had expected. This wasn't what they had planned for. They had thought they could control it, contain it. But now, standing in its presence, Victor realized just how foolish they had been. "Amelia," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "We have to get out of here." Amelia was still on the ground, dazed and disoriented, but she managed to pull herself to her feet. Her eyes were wide with terror as she looked at the subject, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "What? What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Victor admitted, his voice trembling. "But we need to leave. Now." They turned and ran toward the lab's exit, but as they did, the lights flickered again, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Victor could feel that something was happening. The air grew thick, heavy, as if reality itself was warping around them. And then, without warning, the subject moved. It was faster than anything Victor had ever seen. One moment it was writhing in place, and the next it was right in front of them, blocking their path. Victor skidded to a halt, his breath catching in his throat. The subject loomed over them, its form still shifting and changing, but there was something almost deliberate about it now. It was no longer chaotic, no longer wild. It was aware. Victor Amelia's voice was barely a whisper. "What is it doing?" Victor didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to process what was happening, trying to find a way out. But there was no way out. The subject had them cornered. The creature's tendrils began to extend toward them, crackling with energy. Victor could feel the heat emanating from it, could feel the raw power that radiated from its core. He took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to get to the emergency shutdown panel," he said, his voice tight with fear. "If we can shut everything down, we might be able to contain it." Amelia nodded, though her face was pale with terror. "Where is it?" Victor glanced over his shoulder, his eyes locking on a small control panel mounted on the wall near the far end of the lab. It was their only chance. "There," he said, pointing to the panel. "But we have to move fast." They took off again, running toward the panel as fast as their legs would carry them. The subject didn't follow, it didn't need to. Victor could feel its presence, could feel the way it seemed to warp the air around it, as if it was tethered to this reality by only the thinnest of threads. They reached the panel, and Victor immediately began typing in the shutdown codes, his fingers shaking as he worked. Amelia stood beside him, her eyes locked on the creature, watching as it writhed and pulsed with unnatural energy. "Hurry," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "It's getting closer." "I'm trying," Victor muttered, his hands trembling as he typed in the final sequence. But just as he was about to hit the shutdown command, the screen flickered and went black. No, Victor's heart sank as he stared at the darkened screen. No, no, no. Amelia turned to him, her face pale with terror. "What happened?" "The system's down," Victor said, his voice shaking. We're locked out. Amelia's eyes widened in horror. What do we do now? Victor's mind raced, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't think of a solution. They had prepared for everything except this. We run, he said finally, his voice hoarse. We get out of here, and we pray that thing doesn't follow us. Amelia nodded, though her face was pale with fear. Together, they turned and ran toward the lab's exit, their hearts pounding in their chests. But as they reached the door, a wave of energy rippled through the room, and the air around them seemed to warp and twist. Victor turned, his eyes widening as he saw the subject moving toward them, its tendrils of energy crackling with power. And in that moment, he realized the truth. They had opened a door to something they couldn't control, and now there was no way to close it. Ethan Dawson walked down the familiar streets of his neighborhood, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly along the pavement, and he shoved his hands deeper into his pockets as he glanced up at the overcast sky. The stars were hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the streetlights cast long, faint shadows on the ground. The world felt muted, distant, as though he was walking through a dream. But something felt off. Not quite right. Ethan wasn't sure what it was at first. He had walked this route hundreds of times before, taking the same shortcut through the park, past the old oak tree, and down the narrow alley that led to his apartment building. But tonight everything seemed different. The air was colder than usual, even for late autumn. The houses and cars he passed by were still, too still, as if frozen in place. The only sounds were his footsteps and the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. It was unsettling, but he couldn't put his finger on why. He quickened his pace, feeling an odd sense of urgency. Something tugged at him, deep inside his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite explain. Anxiety, maybe, or perhaps something darker, something deeper. As he turned the corner toward his apartment building, he glanced at the windows of the surrounding houses. Most of them were dark, but a few had lights on, casting a warm glow through the curtains. He could see the faint outlines of people inside, moving around, living their lives. It should have been comforting, but instead, it filled him with a strange sense of unease. He reached his building, his fingers fumbling for his keys as he approached the door. The old wooden steps creaked beneath his feet as he climbed them, but the sound seemed distant, muffled. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside, letting out a small sigh of relief as the familiar scent of old wood and worn carpet greeted him. The building was quiet, as it always was this late at night. The hallway stretched out before him, dimly lit by the flickering overhead light. He could hear the soft hum of the radiator in the corner, the gentle creak of the pipes. Everything was as it should be. But that nagging feeling in his chest hadn't gone away. Ethan made his way up the stairs to the second floor, his feet dragging slightly as exhaustion settled over him. He had had a long day at work, and all he wanted was to collapse into bed and forget about the world for a while. But as he reached the landing, he froze. The door to his apartment was open. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, panic flared in his chest. He was certain he had locked it when he left that morning. He always locked it. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway for any signs of movement. But there was nothing. Just the door, slightly ajar, swaying gently on its hinges. Ethan hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open all the way. The apartment was dark, but the faint light from the hallway cast long shadows across the floor. His eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness, and he stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. Everything was exactly where he had left it. The living room was neat and tidy, the furniture arranged just as it had been that morning. His jacket was draped over the back of the couch, his shoes neatly lined up by the door. The kitchen table was cluttered with papers and a half-empty coffee mug, just as he had left it. Nothing was out of place. And yet, something was wrong. He could feel it deep in his bones, a creeping sense of dread that made his skin prickle. He closed the door behind him and flicked on the light switch. The overhead light flickered for a moment before settling into a steady glow, casting the room in harsh, artificial brightness. Ethan stood in the middle of the living room, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for anything to happen. But there was nothing. Just silence. He let out a shaky breath, trying to calm himself. Maybe he had forgotten to lock the door. Maybe he was just tired, and his mind was playing tricks on him. But as he stood there, surrounded by the familiar sights and smells of his apartment, the feeling of wrongness only deepened. Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. He was probably just overreacting. He needed to sleep, that was all. A good night's rest would clear his head. But before he could convince himself to move, something caught his eye. A movement. A flicker of something in the corner of his vision. He turned slowly, his gaze landing on the mirror that hung on the wall by the door. His reflection stared back at him, pale and drawn, his eyes hollow and dark. He looked tired, more tired than he had realized. But that wasn't what had caught his attention. It was the fact that his reflection wasn't moving. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat, his body frozen in place. He blinked, his heart hammering in his chest, but his reflection remained still, staring back at him with lifeless eyes. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe he was just imagining it. But as he took a slow step forward, his reflection remained rooted to the spot. A cold chill swept through him, and the room seemed to spin for a moment. He felt unmoored, disconnected from reality. He took another step forward, his hands trembling as he reached out toward the mirror. And then, suddenly his reflection moved. But it wasn't him. The figure in the mirror tilted its head slightly, as if studying him, its eyes cold and distant. Ethan's stomach twisted in fear as he watched the figure raise a hand slowly, deliberately, and press it against the glass. Ethan stumbled back, his pulse racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He turned away from the mirror, his mind reeling, and ran toward the bedroom. He slammed the door behind him and collapsed onto the bed, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands shook as he buried his face in the pillow, trying to block out the terror that was creeping over him. For what felt like hours, he lay there, his body trembling, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What had he seen? Was he losing his mind? Was it a hallucination? A dream? But as the minutes ticked by, a new thought began to take hold, one that sent a cold wave of dread washing over him. What if it wasn't a hallucination? What if he wasn't imagining it? What if he was the one who wasn't real? The days that followed were a blur. Ethan moved through the world in a haze, the weight of his fear pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He avoided the mirror, refused to look at his reflection, terrified of what he might see. But even without the mirror, the sense of wrongness never left him. It followed him everywhere. At work, he felt disconnected from his surroundings, as though he were walking through a dream. His coworkers' voices sounded distant, muffled, as though they were speaking from far away. He couldn't focus, couldn't think clearly. Every time he tried to concentrate, his mind drifted back to that night, to the image of his reflection moving on its own. His sleep was plagued by nightmares. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart racing, with the feeling that someone was watching him. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the sense of dread that hung over him like a dark cloud. And then, one night, it happened again. He had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when he heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like breathing. He froze, his body tense, every nerve on edge. The sound grew louder, closer, and he realized with a jolt of horror that it was coming from the other side of the room. Slowly, he turned his head, his heart pounding in his chest. There, standing at the foot of his bed, was the figure from the mirror. It was him, his reflection. But there was something wrong with it. Its eyes were empty, hollow, as if all the life had been drained from them. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its movements were slow, deliberate. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure took a step forward, its cold, lifeless eyes locked on him. "What are you?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with fear. The figure didn't respond. It just stared at him, its expression unreadable. Ethan scrambled out of bed, his body shaking with terror. He backed away toward the door, his eyes never leaving the figure. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed at him. Ethan's heart raced, his mind spinning with confusion and fear. What was happening? Was this a dream? Was he going insane? But then, as he stared at the figure, a horrible realization began to take shape in his mind. This wasn't a dream. And he wasn't insane. He was dead. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. He staggered backward, his hands trembling as he pressed them against the wall. "I'm dead," he whispered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. The figure nodded, its eyes still locked on him. Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. How could this be possible? How could he be dead? He remembered walking home, going to work, living his life. Everything had been normal. How could he be dead? But as the pieces slowly fell into place, the truth became impossible to deny. He had died that night. The night he had come home to find the door to his apartment open. Something had happened, an accident, maybe, or something worse. But whatever it was, he had died, and now he was trapped. A ghost, wandering through the world of the living, unaware of his own fate. The figure, his reflection, was a reminder of that, a reflection of the truth he had refused to see. Ethan sank to the floor, his body trembling with the weight of the realization. He was dead, and there was no going back. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and despair. Ethan wandered through the world in a daze, his mind struggling to come to terms with the truth. He no longer felt connected to anything: his job, his apartment, his life. It was all meaningless now. He was a ghost, a shadow of the person he had once been. At first, he tried to ignore it, to go on as though nothing had changed. He went to work, went through the motions of his daily routine, pretending that everything was normal. But it wasn't. Nothing was normal anymore. He felt invisible, like he was walking through the world without anyone noticing him. His coworkers barely acknowledged him, their voices distant and muffled. When he spoke, they didn't seem to hear him, didn't respond to him. It was as though he didn't exist. And maybe he didn't. He stopped going to work after a while. What was the point? No one noticed his absence. No one called to check on him. It was as if he had already faded from their memories, as though he had never been there in the first place. The apartment felt like a prison now, the walls closing in on him. The reflection in the mirror no longer haunted him, it had become his only companion. He would sit for hours, staring at the figure in the glass, wondering what it all meant. Wondering if this was his fate, to be trapped in this limbo forever. He had no answers, only questions. And the worst part was, he didn't even know how he had died. There were no memories of it, no flashes of an accident or violence. Just a gaping hole where his life had once been. Weeks turned into months, and the weight of his existence grew heavier with each passing day. Ethan no longer felt fear or panic, only a deep, overwhelming sadness. He was dead, and there was no escape from it. But one day, as he sat in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection that had become a part of him, something changed. The figure in the glass, the ghost of who he had once been, began to fade. At first, it was subtle, a soft flickering, like the dying light of a candle. But as the minutes passed, the figure grew more and more translucent until it was barely visible. Ethan's heart raced, a strange mix of fear and hope filling his chest. Was this it? Was this the end? He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool surface of the glass. The reflection wavered, then disappeared entirely, leaving only his own pale, drawn face staring back at him. Ethan took a deep breath, his chest tightening with emotion. For the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. He felt release. And as he sat there, alone in the quiet stillness of his apartment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go. Victor Reese hadn't slept in days. The clock on the wall blinked 3:15 a.m., its red numbers cutting through the darkness like the eyes of a predator. He sat in his office, the papers strewn across his desk illuminated only by the soft glow of his laptop. The reports of the experiment project Ether lay in disarray, his carefully crafted equations now an undecipherable mess. His mind raced through the events of the past few weeks, trying to piece together the nightmare that had unfolded. The subject. The containment breach. The moment when everything went wrong. Victor rubbed his temples, the pounding headache that had plagued him for days refusing to subside. Ever since the accident, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him home. Every shadow in his apartment seemed darker, every sound sharper. The air itself felt heavy, as though reality had been warped by the entity they had unleashed in the lab. He wasn't the only one who felt it. Others had reported strange occurrences. Amelia, his assistant, had quit the day after the breach, saying she couldn't take it anymore. Her words haunted him. "We opened a door, we can't close." She had looked terrified when she said it, her hands trembling as she packed her things. Victor hadn't heard from her since. He couldn't blame her. The subject, they had never fully understood what it was, where it had come from, or what it wanted, and now it was loose. No matter how many times he went over the data, no matter how hard he tried to find a solution, the answer eluded him. The energy readings had spiked beyond what their instruments could measure. The electromagnetic fields had collapsed, and then the world had changed. Victor stood and walked to the window, pulling the blinds back to peer into the quiet, darkened street below. It was unsettlingly still, as if the entire world was holding its breath. In the distance, he could just make out the outline of the old hospital, the place where it had all begun. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen, an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Hello, his voice was hoarse, the exhaustion evident. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then a voice, quiet and shaky, came through. "Victor, it's Amelia." His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard from her in weeks. "Amelia, where are you? What happened?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But something is wrong. Ever since the breach, I've been seeing things, shadows, figures in the dark. And it's not just me, Victor. It's happening to other people." Victor's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's spreading," Amelia replied. "Whatever we let out that day, it's affecting others. It's like it's following them. I think it's using them." A cold chill ran down Victor's spine. "Who?" Amelia's voice cracked. "There's a man, a surgeon. And another, he says his wife died in an accident. But I don't think it was an accident. I've seen him in my dreams. And there's a woman. I think she's trapped, but I don't know where. And there's someone else, someone who doesn't even know he's dead." Victor's pulse quickened. It couldn't be possible. But if what she was saying was true, if the entity they had unleashed was somehow spreading, infecting others, then the situation was worse than he had imagined. "Where are you, Amelia?" Victor asked, his voice urgent. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear it, she said, "I don't know." The line went dead. 2 days later. Jonas Stevenson stared at the old, creaking house in front of him. The wind howled through the bare trees that lined the driveway, and the setting sun cast long, eerie shadows across the lawn. His heart pounded in his chest, a sense of dread creeping over him as he stepped out of his truck. He hadn't been back to this house in years, not since the incident. It was the place where he had kept her Nebbia after everything had gone wrong, the place where his life had unraveled. He had locked it all away, buried it deep inside himself, and never spoken of it again. But something had changed in the past few weeks, something he couldn't explain. He had started having dreams, vivid, terrifying dreams of her, of the basement, of the chains. He had woken up in a cold sweat more than once, his heart racing as the memories flooded back. The guilt, the regret, the shame of what he had done. But the dreams weren't just memories. They felt real, too real. And worse, he had started seeing things in the shadows, faint, indistinct figures watching him. He had tried to ignore it, to push it all away, but the feeling wouldn't leave him. Something was calling him back to this place. Jonas stood at the front door, his hand shaking as he reached for the handle. The wood was cold beneath his fingers, and for a moment he considered turning back. But he couldn't. He had to know. He had to face whatever was waiting for him inside. The door creaked open, and Jonas stepped into the darkened hallway. The air was stale, thick with dust and decay. The house smelled of abandonment, of old wood and forgotten memories. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he made his way toward the basement door. It was exactly as he remembered it, the narrow door at the end of the hallway, the key still hanging on the hook beside it. His hand trembled as he unlocked the door and descended the stairs, the darkness swallowing him whole. As he reached the bottom, the faint light from the single overhead bulb flickered, casting long shadows across the concrete walls. The room was empty, the mattress still lying in the corner, untouched. But something was wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. Jonas's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step forward. And then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Breathing. Jonas froze, his blood running cold. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. The breathing grew louder, more insistent, as though it was coming from all around him. Nebbia, he whispered, his voice trembling. There was no response, but the breathing continued, steady and rhythmic, filling the room with an oppressive weight. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Nebbia, or at least it looked like her. But something was wrong. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, and her movements were slow, deliberate. She stared at him, unblinking, her face expressionless. Jonas's heart raced as he backed away, his mind reeling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Nebbia, he whispered again, his voice cracking. The figure took a step toward him, her eyes never leaving his. And then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You can't leave me. Across town. Dr. Samuel Carter stood at the window of his office, staring out at the darkened city below. The lights of the hospital flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the empty streets. His hands trembled as he took a sip of his coffee, his mind racing with the events of the past few days. The patient, the young boy, had died on the operating table. Despite everything he had done, despite all his efforts, he hadn't been able to save him. It wasn't the first time he had lost a patient, but this one felt different. There had been something off about the whole situation. Samuel had been a surgeon for over a decade. He had seen his fair share of trauma and death, but this time the loss had hit him harder than usual. It wasn't just the boy, it was the strange occurrences that had followed. The whispers he had started hearing in the middle of the night, the shadows that seemed to move on their own, the sense that someone or something was watching him. He had tried to brush it off as exhaustion, as the stress of the job, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It had been growing stronger, more insistent, until he couldn't ignore it any longer. He set the coffee cup down and rubbed his temples, trying to clear his mind. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of the boy lying on the operating table, his lifeless eyes staring up at him. And then there were the dreams of a woman chained in a dark basement, calling out for help. the dreams of a man standing at the foot of his bed, watching him with cold, hollow eyes. Samuel's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen, an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, a voice, barely a whisper, said, "It's coming for you." Samuel's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" The voice didn't answer. The line went dead. Elsewhere. Ethan Dawson stood in front of the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with lifeless eyes. He had been dead for weeks now, though he hadn't realized it at first. The discovery had come slowly, creeping over him like a fog, until the truth was impossible to ignore. He was a ghost. At first, he had been terrified, but as the days passed, the fear had been replaced by a deep, overwhelming sadness. He wandered through the world, invisible, untouchable, a shadow of the person he had once been. But lately, something had changed. The world around him had started to shift, to warp in ways he couldn't explain. He had started seeing things, shadows, figures lurking at the edges of his vision, whispering to him, calling out to him. And then there were the dreams. Dreams of a man in a lab staring at strange energy readings, his face filled with terror. Dreams of a woman trapped in a basement, her eyes hollow and empty. Dreams of a surgeon standing over a boy's lifeless body, his hands trembling with guilt. Ethan didn't understand it, but deep down he knew that all of this, the shadows, the whispers, the dreams, it was connected. The entity they had unleashed, the one that had followed him through the afterlife, was spreading, infecting others. He wasn't the only one trapped in this nightmare. The convergence. The hospital loomed large in the distance, its dark windows reflecting the faint light of the moon. Inside, in one of the empty operating rooms, the shadows began to stir. Victor, Jonas, Samuel, and Ethan, all of their paths had led them here, to this place where the final confrontation awaited. The entity, the subject, had drawn them together, pulling them into its web, feeding off their guilt, their fear, their regrets. It had taken control of their lives, their fates, and now it was time to face it. As they stood together in the cold, sterile room, the shadows shifted, coalescing into a single, dark figure. The air grew thick with tension, the weight of their shared nightmares pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. The entity twisting and writhing loomed over them, its form barely recognizable, a mass of darkness and energy. Victor took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "We did this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We let it out." Jonas clenched his fists, his eyes filled with regret. "I never meant to hurt her." Samuel's hands shook as he stared at the figure. "I tried to save them. I tried." Ethan, standing at the edge of the room, his ghostly form flickering, said nothing. He had accepted his fate long ago. The entity's eyes, cold and empty, locked onto them, and in that moment they understood. There was no escape,